Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special edition of Spark Freedom's Spark Session webinar broadcast. Today we are talking about building and developing a social media policy. There was a discussion just about a week ago on the Communications Director listserv for our network of nonprofits asking around about how do you build a social media policy, where do you even begin, what kind of questions do you need to ask, and just people trying to get insight into whether their organization needs a social media policy, and the answer is yes, and how do you go about building that. So I'm really excited about this webinar. We've got two amazing guests on today, both of whom have experience dealing with this, and they're going to share their expertise with us. So the first person is Sarah Johnson. She's my coworker. We work together here at Spark Freedom, and she is our Director of Marketing and Communications. She's done many of these social media policies for both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, so she brings a wealth of knowledge about the topic to the webinar. And then we also have Dave Beer with the Sutherland Institute. Dave recently built his own social media policy and implemented it at his organization, so he's ready to share about that experience, what the lessons he learned were, and some of the potential pitfalls and hurdles that he had to clear. So I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today. Before we get started, though, I want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to engage with us. We want you to be able to ask questions and to and get topics that you want to know about talked about. So if you have a question, I'm sharing the screen with you right now. You can tweet at us. At Spark Freedom is our Twitter handle. Use the hashtag SparkSession, and we will do our best to address any questions that you have. We'll be watching that thing the whole time. So without any further ado, let's get into the topic. Sarah, go ahead and just give us a little bit of an idea of what is a social media policy and why does an organization need to have one?
Well, a social media policy really just, you create one just to protect yourself as an organization. You want to make sure that your employees know what is and isn't appropriate to post online, even if they're not considered spokespeople for the organization. You want to make sure that even if they're posting on their personal accounts, they know that, for example, that they should say that they are not official spokespeople, or that they should disclose their relationship with your organization. Say, you work for a nonprofit that, let's say the Red Cross, and they're very interested in organ donation or something like that, that's in a similar sort of field, that they should, if they're writing a blog post, even on their personal blog, that they should disclose their relationship with the Red Cross before they, write their post or tweet or whatever. So it's just really important. Also, when you develop your policy and you're instilling it across the organization, it's a great chance to talk to your employees about what your strategy is with your online communications or just your communications in general. What is your organization's voice, and how do you talk with people online, and what does that sound like? So that's why it's important. And two, it guards you legally. It gives you a reason to let people go if they go rogue.
Okay. Well, so maybe define for me a little bit the difference between a social media policy, which is what we're talking about today, and a social media strategy. Is there a difference between the two topics?
There is, yeah. A social media strategy is going to say, it will address, what your voice is or what your copy strategy is. But it will also, so the strategy addresses your copy. Both of them do. Sorry, let me get back. But the strategy will talk more about, like, hey, on LinkedIn, we want this many number of followers, or we want this many people engaged with us. It gets more into the nitty-gritty of metrics, like how do we engage people online? How do we make sure that we're getting more followers? Things like that. And the policy just addresses, hey, let's cover our hind end here and make sure that if like a situation with US Air happens, that we can terminate or guard against that.
Why
another legal reason to have the policy is that it's something that you can actually share with media. If something actually happens, you can say, we did have a policy in place, and this person was let go, or this was the kind of the repercussions or the reprimand or whatever that we had in place already due to the social media policy that we had.
Okay. Well, so I'm hearing you guys talk a lot about covering yourself in social media and making sure that you have legal protection. But what are some other reasons why an organization should implement a social media policy besides legally protecting themselves from a catastrophe?
One reason that we did it was that we could get clarification as a staff on what our brand should be in social media, the kind of voice that we should have in social media. And so one of the important things that we had to decide as a staff was that we were not going to punch down in our social media engagement. In other words, there's a lot of trolls and a lot of people who would like to get you riled on social media, especially in the industry that we're in. And so we have to be choosy about who we're going to engage with and who we're not going to engage with. And sometimes that means you'll probably say less than you'd like to say. So it takes some restraint, but for Sutherland anyway, we decided that we were going to have just a friendly, open, positive, engaging voice, and we weren't going to resort to snark or sarcasm or insults. And when that's all that you're getting from some of the haters or the trolls on Twitter or Facebook, it's hard. But we said don't punch down. I'll always try to elevate the conversation. So that was an important aspect of why we wanted to establish a policy.
So when it comes to building a social media policy, some groups have gotten it very right, some groups have gotten it wrong, or some groups have not chosen to pursue that path. What are some of the most egregious mess-ups that you guys have seen take place in the social media sphere in recent times? I mean, there's always things that are coming up, but I think that by highlighting a couple of these examples, we can see what we shouldn't be doing or what we need to be aware of can happen without a social media policy. Do you guys have any good examples of groups that haven't put one in place or missed the mark even though they had one?
Yeah, I'll just share one really quick that I saw. It was the recent tweet from the State Department, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was about dealing with what was going on in Russia and the Ukraine, and they said something about remember hashtag peace or something, and so they just got ridiculed because they were like trying to hold Russia to some sort of Twitter peace standard, and it just made them look ridiculous. So from a policy standpoint, just make sure that the things that you're tweeting don't make you look foolish. And I think the right especially picked up on the State Department, made kind of a meme out of it because it was such a ridiculous tweet.
Right. Sarah, what about you? Any interesting examples of groups that have kind of gotten off the rails on social media, either because they didn't have a social media policy or because they forgot the one that they implemented?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many of them, honestly, and a lot of them just, who knows if they have a social media policy, like US Air, right. I mean, that was absolutely just horrible tweet.
We can't even really go into describing it here on the this is family friendly.
We're not rated like that.
Yeah. But in that case, it was an intern that was working for them or an employee that it was just a software glitch, right? And you're going to encounter that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you can hire the best people, and this poor person, I believe they were a new hire. Someone had tweeted that photo, like direct message, from what I understand. Yeah. Someone had direct messaged that photo to them, and then when the employee went to attach a photo, that one came up and it sent out to everyone. And obviously, if you've seen it, you know how terrible that is. And actually, I think, I wasn't sure how I felt about this in the beginning, but US Air wound up just kind of reprimanding the person and not terminating them. And I actually think that that's the right move.
And a good social media policy will help dictate your response, right? I mean, crises are unavoidable. This was a simple misclick on a keyboard. There was nothing malicious on behalf of the employee. and having a policy in place where there's clarity about how to respond is also beneficial.
Exactly, yeah, because it doesn't leave you, in the wee hours trying to figure out, oh my gosh, so what should we do and how do we respond? That gets into, we've got this guide coming out, and that gets into the online crisis communications area. So you've got this policy in place, and then once the policy is breached, then you get into the crisis communications area.
So the purpose of building a guide, if I understand you correctly, is setting yourself up so you don't have a crisis. Absolutely. And then for the 1% of the time that you do have a crisis, the policy helps inform you how to respond.
It does, and just like Dave was saying, it helps with the media as well to say, like, hey, this isn't how we roll. This isn't what we would normally say. We had a very bad situation happen, and we're taking care of it.
Sure.
Another incident that comes to mind is even Stephen Colbert. He had a huge backlash because of something that was from the official, his Colbert Report show Twitter account, which he ended up taking down. He doesn't even use it, but the tweet was sent out without context, was how he explained it. And so when you're tweeting, make sure that what you're tweeting is understandable and is in context, so that there's not this misunderstanding. And he ended up, there was actually, the left is pretty malicious even with their own sometimes. So there's a whole cancel culture hashtag because of a tweet. So.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. We're talking.
You can save yourself from a
We're getting a little bit of static from you, Dave. The internet connection's wonking out a little bit. So, but I think you bring up a really good point in that we're talking a lot about Twitter here, but Twitter is not the only social media tool available to people, even though it often results in the most online mistakes. I mean, you're covering yourself on Facebook and on LinkedIn and Google Plus for the time that it's still around.
Right.
And
blog posts too. It extends well beyond just social to any sort of like microblog. Well, I guess Twitter is a microblogger.
Sure.
What is it? The
Tumblr.
Tumblr is the microblog. So yeah, blogging, or even to your even to your employees who are writing on your organization's page. Their page. You've got to make sure that policy is in place for that as well.
So making sure that your policy takes into account the variety of different styles even of social media and just digital platforms that are available to you. And I think that actually goes back to what you were saying before, Sarah. This social media policy has to work in harmony with your social media or your digital strategy, because knowing we are going to take a very direct approach on these 3 platforms. We're going to be on Facebook, Twitter, and on a blog. That'll inform your policy, right?
It will, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, they definitely need to work in harmony with each other. And, I've always recommended at the beginning of a social media or an online communications policy, let me rephrase to make sure that I include everything, that you define what you're covering. So does it cover your organization's website? Does it cover microblogs? Does it cover Instagram? Does it cover Twitter? So, defining exactly what your social media or your online communication policy covers is really, really important. Okay. And that, like you were saying, goes hand in hand with the strategy.
Yeah. In addition to that, I think you have to get clarity on why you're on those different mediums. What's your purpose? What are you trying to accomplish? Because I think that will really guide your voice, the content that you're sharing on those different mediums. And so that's one thing that we did at the beginning of our policy, was we established what the purpose was for us engaging in these different mediums, and that kind of guided us the rest of the way.
Well, so let's get a little bit into how-to mode. Let's talk us through what are the different elements that people need to make sure that they include if they're building a social media policy.
I would say you want to make sure that employees understand that they are never considered spokespeople unless they have been given that power by the organization, so that they should never Make sure that that is in in writing. You're not to talk on behalf of the organization ever, 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 unless that is your role. So I think that's number one. Dave and I can bounce back and forth, so I don't just take up both.
What about tone? You want to make sure to address tone too, right?
Yeah, I was going to get to that. Can you guys hear me okay now?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. After you've established the purpose, that leads right into style and tone, as you referenced. What kind of voice are you going to have on social media? And so we just kind of listed a list of bullet points with the different kind of tone and style that we wanted, and we just said intelligent, positive, reliable, appropriately humorous, respectful, nonpartisan, mature, honest, candid, insightful, independent. So you just need to decide, what kind of voice, and obviously it should match what your broader brand and your broader goals as an institution are, so there's not this dissonance between how you behave on social media versus how you want to appear outside of social media.
Right. I would also say when you're going to create your policy, don't let perfection get in the way of the good. Your social media policy, your online communications policy should be considered a living document. Technology changes every single day, and your policy should reflect that. So that's really important as you go into creating one, to not to not be worried about like, oh, it's got to be absolutely perfect and encompass everything. Like, just, it's more important to get something down now. And cover yourself now, and then tinker with it as you go on and as things change in the digital space.
Okay. Are there any other elements that people need to consider? Like, do they need to have disclaimers or employee protocol, or what are some other components that they want to make sure to include in their social media policy as they're building it?
Well, we also in ours outlined, as has kind of been referenced, the roles and responsibilities, who's in charge of what. And then if there is a misstep, what are the different procedures for handling that misstep? Is there a three strikes and you're out policy, or what's your policy there? In addition, I wanted to go back really quick to how your social media actions should be. There's also a list that we have about what they should not be, and it's simple things like they shouldn't ever be rude. They shouldn't ever share information that shouldn't be shared, that might be sensitive, shouldn't be partisan, shouldn't be demeaning, offensive, things like that. So there's do's and there's don'ts for ours.
Okay.
I would also say something about, in your policy, you also want to say something about like not interfering with NLRA standards or protocols, because you like, as you say, hey, we reserve the right to monitor your personal accounts. You want to make sure that you're covered with making sure that your employees don't feel threatened. So I think that's important.
And there's also a difference.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, there's also a difference between kind of employee level within the organization. For instance, your CEO has to be a lot more careful about certain things than the manager of social media.
Absolutely.
The CEO shouldn't be tweeting endorsements for candidates, even though it's from his personal account. Or she shouldn't be tweeting scathing remarks about candidates. It's just inappropriate, especially if you're a C3. You can get into a lot of trouble because the higher level employees are considered essentially the face of the organization. So there's not a lot of difference between the official organization account and the CEO's account. They really have to be careful there.
Hey, Dave, we just got a question in on Twitter, and I don't know if you've got any history with this at Sutherland, but the question is, what if your employees say it's not appropriate for the company to control or monitor their private social media accounts? Did y'all encounter any trouble with that or problems as you implemented your policy?
You know what? The interesting result of implementing this policy is that employees who have had trouble from their personal Twitter accounts had trouble following the policy. They essentially just stopped tweeting. And so, as an employee, the priority has to be the good of the organization. And so, if they're not mature enough to understand that they have to set aside some of the things that they maybe would like to tweet or post on Facebook or whatever, then there has to be further discussions there. But because you have to just be clear that as an employee of the organization, your behavior reflects on us. If your behavior is going to be harmful to us, then you're going to have to, take some next steps there.
Yeah, and I think kind of how I've always talked to people about it and how to determine what's appropriate and what's not is if you wouldn't say it to your boss's boss, don't say it on Twitter. Don't say it on Facebook, and that's a good guidepost because a lot of people feel security in the anonymity that social media provides, and with a social media policy, you shouldn't feel so secure, and that's a good thing.
Is it something when you're describing, limiting or restricting what an employee can say that is damaging to the company? In today's day and age, just with the prevalence of social media and people tweeting about everything from a night out at the bar to hanging out with their friends to, some people posting that they're getting into legal trouble with the law. People just seem to have no filter sometimes when it comes to using their social media accounts. How does that translate over into a social media policy with a nonprofit? Can an employee get in trouble for saying something that maybe the company wouldn't agree with, but is really contained in their personal social or their personal life?
Well, I think it depends from a legal perspective. It depends on your state. For instance, Utah is at-will employment, and so employees here understand that they can be let go for any or no reason. So I think that's actually really helpful. But for other states, maybe that's actually a policy push, try to change the employee statute in the law. But beyond that, maybe one small thing they can do is if they're going to have some issue there, don't mention in their Twitter profile that they are an employee. That's kind of a small thing because it's not hard for people to find that out. But if they're going to kind of continually have issues there, that's at least kind of one level of separation.
Right.
They don't have to put that in their profile. I don't know. Sarah, any thoughts on that?
I agree. Yeah, I would err on the side of not saying things that would be inflammatory online if you're involved with an organization that, has a modicum of respect. But yeah, I think disengaging with the company online, like don't follow us, we won't follow you, don't mention us, that you work here kind of thing is, if you can't get rid of them and that's not how you want to go about it, I think that's a good alternative.
Well, and I think the point you guys are making is a good one. You mentioned before, somebody like the CEO, they are a public figure, right? And they're probably going to be attached to the company no matter what, as opposed to the guy in the mailroom, or maybe the receptionist, or one of the policy people, or an engineer, or depending on the company that you're at. There's different levels there, but how detailed do you get in the social media policy when you talk about what an employee can or cannot say, either officially or unofficially, on behalf of the company?
I don't think that you get detailed in that you say you can't say this and you can say that. I think you say if we deem it as inappropriate or reflecting poorly on the organization, our clients, the people we work with, your coworkers, or if it's harassment, then it's bad. So I don't think you need to get into specifics of what is and is not appropriate. If we deem it inappropriate, it's inappropriate, period.
And I think it just goes back to the fact that the reality is social media is a part of your job performance. And so, therefore, I think it's one of the factors that is reviewed. Are you mature enough and responsible enough in your social media interactions to not embarrass the company? If you're not, there's some issues there.
Sure, but I mean more specifically, you guys are talking about it in a professional context where an employee is talking maybe on behalf of the company, but again, coming back to creating clarity for the employee. I mean, we want to make sure that the employee and the employer have clarity about their relationship, and is an employee free to go off on a rant on social media in their private life about a private topic and know that they come into the work the next day and still have a job, right? I mean, at what point does free speech hit representing your company well, I suppose is the ultimate question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I was saying about, as long as it doesn't reflect poorly on the organization, and this is, for a personal account as well, as long as it doesn't reflect poorly on the organization or the people the organization works with or the other companies the organization works with,
sure,
then it's good to go. If you want to go on a rant about the fact that you got, 5 speeding tickets, then that's fine, because I don't see that coming back on the organization as long as you don't drive a bus.
Right.
But if you want to go on to a rant about X organization who your organization works with,
right,
then that's inappropriate, even on your personal account.
Okay. Great job on this topic, guys. It's good information to have. Go ahead, Dave. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying we left it pretty broad in our policy as far as like specifics from personal accounts. We just said, sound judgment is required to determine what types of information should or should not be shared. And we went on a little bit from that, but essentially we kind of put the onus on the employee. So we've in the policy we've outlined our social media purpose, our style guide with the do's and the don'ts, roles and responsibilities. All of those things are outlined, and then we put the responsibility on them to follow those guidelines. We're not going to put every single kind of guideline. We're not going to write it down in the policy. We just trust that they can use sound judgment.
Right.
Dave, I'm especially interested to hear kind of just if you can tell your story really quickly about taking a social media policy for Sutherland from concept to completion. I'm sure that there was, a lot of, ups and downs in that journey from, finding, being tasked with creating the policy to working with the different departments to get their takes on it to ultimately getting it approved, and then the real challenge of implementing it with your staff. Can you just kind of give us that quick story arc?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so first, obviously, we realized that we had kind of some issues with what was going on with social media, and so we saw a need, and unfortunately, we didn't have Spark Freedom's, kind of style guide or primer to guide us, and so I actually reached out to some people in the SPN network to see, what they had done, and then I just searched online Coca-Cola's social media policy. I found just through Google and some other big corporations, and so kind of modeled some of it from there. Talked to the different directors of the departments at Sutherland, got all their feedback and input, and then just put it together, shared that, got more feedback, and we actually felt like we needed to share our policy with our board. Okay. And so we shared it with our board, and it was amended kind of extensively in some parts of the policy, and until the board thought it was where it should be, and then they approved it, and it's in place now. So I think it's basically doing, recognizing what the needs are of your organization, what the purpose of social media is for your organization, how it's helping you achieve your goals, and then finding examples, doing some research, and modeling it and refining it, and then whatever the approval process is.
What was the time requirement? How many hours do you think between meetings and board approvals and the time that you spent actually researching, putting this together? I mean, when an organization goes to do this, what is the level of expectation? This obviously isn't a Friday afternoon project.
No, it's not. You're going to have to give yourself some time. I would say if someone came to you or you decided you wanted a social media policy, given everything else that you have to do, I would say give yourself a couple of weeks, okay, so that you can dedicate, an hour or two here and there, and give time for feedback and all of that.
What departments did you get feedback from? I mean, it sounds like you involved a lot of your organization. I mean, were you talking with communications, legal, executive? Were there other departments that you ended up talking to?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it was policy because we wanted to get their take on content and tone. So we talked to our policy department. We talked to our public affairs department, which interfaces with elected officials, legal, our president. Um, development wasn't really involved
Sure.
for us, and then the board. So there were a lot of people who kind of had a hand in it. But if you establish that deadline and say, hey, we have to get this done in a couple weeks, people are usually pretty good about doing their part.
All right, so you've got the finalized document in hand. It's board approved, stamp of approval on it. I mean, then the real challenge comes up. All right, now you got to implement it. How did you roll it out to the staff? What was the general reception like? What challenges did you face, if there were any, to get people to adhere to it? Give us a little bit of sense of what the implementation went.
Yeah, the rollout was really simple. We ended up just sending out an email with the policy and telling everyone kind of the process it had gone through, that this is the final policy, it's been approved by the board. And then the reaction mostly was like, oh, I didn't know we really needed one, because I think most of the staff is fine. Most of the staff doesn't actually tweet from their personal account. There's just a handful of us who do. And then, I'm in charge of the official Sutherland account. And so it shouldn't be, and it really wasn't a big deal for the employees who have had issues. They, like I said before, they essentially stopped tweeting from their personal account because they just came to the conclusion that they couldn't tweet and abide by the policy. So for the company, they just kind of shut down. So, hopefully that's not going to be the case for most people. But if you can't control your tone and style, then that might be the best solution.
Sure. Well, so and a question now for both of you. Dave, you mentioned that you are the primary driver of social media at Sutherland. You handle the official accounts. So I'm going to ask a two-part question. One, we've talked a little bit about employees and the restrictions on, or the guidelines, probably is a better word, on using their personal accounts. How do you engage them in an official capacity? And then the other part of the question is, do you have one person in charge of all social media, or do you divide the responsibilities among who manages the official organizational accounts?
Well, so the second question, myself, and then we have another person in communications who helps me, and it's to the point where I trust her, and so I don't have to review what she's putting out. Okay. And then we actually do some contract work with a third party who posts stuff for us, but they pass it all through us, and so it's either goes through me or this other person in communications first. And I didn't quite understand what you were asking in the first question about how we interact with the personal accounts.
Sure. So we've talked earlier in the webinar about employees and their personal tweets, but a lot of groups now, and we recently did a Spark Session webinar on brand advocacy, and some of the strongest brand advocates you can have are your own employees, and getting them to tweet about the organization or to post on Facebook about the organization in a slightly more official capacity rather than just in passing. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on how do you involve employees that way.
Yeah, definitely. If there's like policy people especially who are experts in their areas, we really encourage them to tweet. But on the other hand, there's people in public affairs who have really good relationships with the governor's office, with elected officials. They don't tweet at all because they feel like that would jeopardize that confidentiality that they have with those elected officials. Mm-hmm. And that's the priority. And so they're in a lot of meetings, they have a lot of amazing conversations, but they never share those online because it would hurt that relationship. So it goes back to the purpose of your social media, And for us, part of the purpose is to show that we're broad and deep on a lot of different policy areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we really encourage our policy people to tweet. But at the same time, we don't jeopardize those relationships that public affairs have.
Sarah, our own Spark Freedom internal policy has you as the sole operator of social media, and that differs a little bit from what Dave was talking about. Can you describe how we set it up and why the difference is important to you?
Sure. We set it up the way that we did primarily because we're a smaller organization. You know, we've all got our kind of siloed responsibilities, and you know, if you know, let's say LASA, for example, wants to send something out, I just want it to go through me first, mainly because of timing situations. It has nothing to do with my trust on whether or not, you know, LASA or Lonnie or Nicole, you know.
You never know when I'm going to say something crazy.
Right. I know y'all aren't going to say anything crazy, but I have, you know, sort of like a strategy going with timing and testing messaging, and so I want to make sure that, you know, whatever LASA wants to send or whatever Lonnie wants to send may be fits in with that testing. So that's why we have it going through one person. When you get into a larger organization, that's just really not probably a possibility to have it go through one person. It would probably be structured more like Dave's, where you empower people below you to take care of those things. But you all are in tune with the strategy, so that makes sense in a larger organization.
Great. All right, well, we're getting close to the end of our time, so I want to make sure that people know that they can ask questions. If you want to talk about, want us to hone in on anything that we've already talked about, please tweet at us using the hashtag #SparkSession, and we'll address it. And then, of course, we have our grand reveal at the end of a new resource that we'll make available to you. So, Sarah, Dave, any points that you guys want to hone in on before we look to the questions and wrap this thing up?
I think one of my favorite things to think about when I think about employees engaging on social media and how the organization should respond is to think of empowering them but not abandoning them. So empower them to be creative online and to, you know, show a personality and show a personality for the organization if they're engaging for the organization online. But don't leave them high and dry, and then they have no understanding of what the expectations are for them. So empower, don't abandon.
Yeah, kind of to go along with that, I think social media should be really collaborative with your team. So they should be tweeting. And like I said, for us, especially our policy people do an amazing job in tweeting and kind of showing our strength and our breadth and our depth on policy issues. But even if your other staff are not tweeting or using Facebook, I always encourage them to share content with me. You know, did you read a story that was great, or is there a quote that's amazing, or an issue that you want to weigh in on? So the collaboration that you can get from your team really enriches and makes better your presence on social media. So I don't think it should be exclusive. You know, you may have one voice that it goes through, but you should be getting input from everybody.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. It looks like we got most of the questions answered from the ones that I've seen. So
sorry, Lass. We did have a couple on from the registration page, and they were about how to measure social media goals and how to figure out what the time allotted to each social platform was. And that's going to be coming out in another guide. That's more centered towards social media strategy, not policy. Right. So to those who ask those questions, stay tuned, and we did not forget about you. And then let's see. That also there was someone who asked about, you know, what happens if my account gets hacked and it sends out spam, and that's addressed in the crisis communications, which you will get with the full, not the pre-release guide, but the full release guide once we finish that up. So do not.
So if you saw our announcements about this webinar, you know that we are sending out a pre-release version of our online reputation management guide, or sorry, Sarah, our Spark Freedom's guide to online reputation management. Yes. I've had to adjust my thinking a little bit on that. And within, we cover a wide spectrum of topics relating to online reputation, including crisis communications and building a social media policy. So, and this guide, like Sarah said, is going to be the first in an entire series of different topics that we're going to cover. So we'll cover 5 topics in this first guide, but then we're going to release a number of other ones that address things like social media strategy and online digital strategy and other topics. So we're really excited about this whole series that's coming out. By attending this webinar today, you've entitled yourself to a free pre-release copy that we will be emailing to you. So look for that in your inbox later today, and then also anticipate the full guide that will be coming out in the next month or so.
Yeah.
Also, before we wrap up the webinar, I want to remind you that we are doing another Spark session, our regularly scheduled Spark session, on May 22nd. It's a Thursday at 1 p.m. So Chip Oglesby with Creative Spark Columbia is going to be coming on and talking about Google Analytics. So you'll read a little bit about that in our guide, and then Chip will come in and share his vast expertise on the topic. So, yeah. All right, well, thank you both, Sarah and Dave. It's been great having you guys on here. Thank you for all your insight into building a strong social media policy. I know that you have your Twitter handles on there on your lower third, so if people want to reach out to you individually, they're able to do that and ask you follow-up questions, or as they're building their social media policy, know that they have access to you and to Spark Freedom. We're here to help. If you want our templates, or if you want access to our guide, there's lots of great information in there that you can use. So thanks for joining the webinar today, everybody. I hope you have a great day. We'll see you on the next Spark session.
Great. Thanks.
See ya.